That's it. All right, so let's get started.
Okay.
I'm sure people have busy schedules, so we want to keep on track. Welcome, everyone. Really excited for today. This is our second installment of our Design Trend webinar series on biophilic design. This is a partnership between Iguzini and Mesa Verde. The webinar will be brought to you again by Alem Sklar, who is our design trend expert. I just want to throw in a couple of words before Alem starts. This one is very exciting. It is called Written in Stone. It is about desert power and the trend of the movement of desert design within biophilia. I feel personally connected to this one. I'm really excited. I spent a lot of years in my university days last century trekking through the deserts of the Sinai and the Negev. I had some very special encounters, tour guiding with Bedouins and getting to know their world. And I had some really amazing experiences. And the most special thing about the desert for me was it's seemingly so simple when you enter, two basic colors, blue and brown. And then as you spend more and more time there, those colors just layer in upon themselves. The sky, the sand, the rock, the sea that surrounds so many deserts. And one of the things that really came out of it for me, shared with me by the Bedouins, is that if you listen closely, you can always hear the wind, and you can really sort of feel how the sound of creation comes out of the desert. So I'm really excited to present to you Alem Sklar from Mesa Verde and Iguzini, Written in Stone, Desert Power. With that, Alem, you're on.
Okay. Thank you, Aaron. That was a beautiful introduction. I love it.
My pleasure.
It definitely captures the spirit of the desert and what makes it precious and important. So I'm going to go into the presentation, and I'm just going to get confirmation. I think actually that I'm not getting confirmation that I have the presentation after all this. One second. Sorry about that. What I did was I went full screen onto the presentation. Okay, here we go. Good? I need to know from everybody if this is good, if this is okay.
We see the icons on the side.
You see the icons on the side. Thank you so much. Let's go into full screen. When I do that, it gives me.
It's blank.
It's blank. It's blank. So just so you guys know, we did a huge amount of experimentation and none of it is working. So I'm just going to go, I'm actually going to turn off my thing for a second and go here to make sure we have. How is that now?
I still see the icons, but we can see the presentation.
You know what? This is horrible. Okay, here we go. Here we go. You know what? It's good to know. And now it should be good.
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay. Nothing like a little bit of humanity at the beginning of a presentation.
There you go. We don't see you though, Alem. You want to turn your camera back on?
You don't see me. Do you need? Okay, sure. If people want to see me. But my concern is when I put myself on, I don't see the presentation.
Okay, so let's go for it however you're comfortable.
Let's go for it like this. Okay.
Well, we see the icons now. That's good.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, let's jump right in, guys. Let's not screw around here. So I like to talk a little bit before I begin. I like to talk about, and I wish that you could see me because it would be ideal. What I'd like to talk about here is the fact that what I think trends are is a response to a social need. And it's really important for me to explain what I mean by that, because I don't think that we get attracted to or interested in stories by mistake. I feel like we are drawn to stories because they resonate, but mostly because they give us answers about the problems that we're facing currently and about how to approach those problems and how to maybe solve those problems, and even more so, what is the heroic behavior in this situation? What is the right behavior? What is the path through the obstacle? And so the problem here, or the question here, is why is the desert and the desert palette, for all of you interior designers out there, I'm sure you've been aware of the prevalence of terracotta and mustards and ochres and all of these desert colors. Why is the desert becoming a focus of attention for designers and architects and artists that are creating environments for people? Because generally, us as designers and artists, we're creating the backdrop for people's lives. In a lot of ways, you can think of it almost as set design for people's lives. And the question is, why would we be attracted to the desert motif? And how does that relate to biophilia in general? One of the things about the desert, I think, that's important to remember is that I think all of us know that it is at the heart of the monotheistic religions. If we think about a lot of the origin stories of Judaism and Christianity and Islam, a lot of them occur in the desert. So it is a beginning place. And the reason that we call this webinar Written in Stone is because generally the most powerful laws of your culture, right, are written in stone. They're laws that can't be violated. And a lot of our fundamental laws of community and of how to treat each other and of what is wrong and right were established in these desert environments. And it's important to know that with those laws, a kind of echo of the desert as a symbol kind of comes with us through the centuries. And we associate the desert landscape with these kind of fundamental laws of justice, of ethics, of wrong and right that kind of transcend religion, right? They're the basic rules of community living, and they transcend the differences between cultures. So the question is, why would this be a relevant topic right now? And there is no avoiding the fact that climate change is one of the dominant news stories in our culture right now. And we just had the meeting in Scotland that didn't go very well. And one of the effects of climate change is something called desertification. It's a tough word for me. And basically what that means is that if we use the resources of the planet without any kind of sense of limitation or adaptation, we use them up. And desertification is a specific problem that occurs within deserts, but then spreads outward, of the land becoming less and less arable and fertile. And what that means is that we can't plant anything, and that means that we can't eat anything. So that kind of expanse of desertification, you're gonna laugh at me, but it's really a tough word for me, desertification, probably because it's a very disturbing concept, is something that's confronting us around the African deserts, around the Chinese deserts, around the Arab deserts, around the Israel deserts, and in the American Southwest. So it's really a global problem. Another aspect of the desert that I think makes it so attractive to popular culture is this new obsession with colonizing Mars that's almost impossible to ignore, because two of the most rich men in the world, in fact, I think they're number one and number two, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, are obsessed with colonizing Mars, and in fact are in some kind of head-to-head conflict or competition about who's going to own that project and who's obviously going to be able to profit from that project. What's fascinating about the project with Mars is that Mars itself, as a goal, as a place to go to, as a secondary planet for us, it's sort of an ironic choice, because it's fundamentally a desert. It's a planet that's undergone the desertification that we're presently threatened with, and all of the riverbeds and all of the water has dried up on that planet. And so the idea that that becomes then the object of a future pilgrimage is ironic. But what it is, and I think what attracts us to the desert planet as a potential promised land, is that it can be linked back to that desert mythology, that sense that by going through the desert, we potentially could reach a promised land. And that's the power of the mythology and story on the creative mind, is that we have this sense that people are able, if people can brave the desert and if people can find a way to live in the desert, there's that sense of that potential promised land that might come from it. And that allows us, or that propels us, to think about Mars as a viable option. One of the things about all the work that's going into going to Mars that's been rather controversial is, why are these billionaires putting all of this money into getting us to Mars and not into figuring out climate solutions here? And you know what? That's a question for all creative and all artistic people. We love the idea of a mythic voyage and of a huge challenge, though I'm not pretending to understand what's going on with them. But the idea that we can abandon this planet and these problems and then recreate ourselves in the desert of Mars, when you think about our mythology, the mythology of our culture, and the fact that we made ourselves in the desert and that we built ourselves as a culture in the desert, it kind of makes sense that we would think, okay, we've made a mess of it down here. We're going to take a risk of recreating a new community on the desert planet. But for whatever the reason is, all of their intellectual resources and a lot of their money are going to figuring out not only how to get to Mars, but how to live on Mars. And that's another reason that the desert, I think, is an important cultural phenomenon. The truth is, a lot of imagination can happen in the desert. And part of the reason that the desert is such a ripe source of imagination is that it's a blank canvas in a lot of ways. If you think about it, it's arid and enormous. And one of the things about a landscape that has that level of prospect or openness and at the same time monotony is that it forces one to think more creatively and to go inside and to project onto this blank canvas new worlds. And when you think about what we're going through right now, the fact that we're actually in a situation of crisis in a lot of ways, where we're not sure what the future holds, and probably for the first time in modern history, we can't be sure that the future will be better than the past. And in fact, there's a lot of kind of apocalyptic feeling about the future. The symbol of the desert as a blank canvas, like Mars, where we get a chance to go back to the desert and renew ourselves and renew our vision of who we can be, makes a lot of sense. And one of the other concepts about the desert that comes up even in religious texts is the idea that because it is so bare, there's a kind of purity that emerges out of that. And a lot of what makes humans complex and I don't want to say sinful, but lost, let's say, is their attraction to a tremendous amount of abundance and an opportunity to sin, let's say. And there's something about the desert, because it is so arid, there's really nothing to do but go within. And so it's become a very potent symbol of wisdom and of reevaluation. Again, really resonant for the time that we're living in. Another thing to notice about the desert in particular, and I haven't gone myself, though I have to admit that I've become more and more curious over time, is something called Burning Man, which is a festival that occurs in the desert. And it's probably one of the most creative festivals on the planet right now. It attracts a tremendous amount of artists and engineers and designers, people like ourselves, that feel like they're going to this open space that isn't owned by anybody. So again, it's this sort of utopian public space where people get to create these huge art installations and are inspired by that environment, not only to create, beautiful architecture and interesting ideas, but to take in one of the most important considerations of our time, which is sustainability. So ironically, having to create in the desert as a limitation forces these creative people to think about sustainability, which is, I think, one of the most important issues of our time for creative people. It actually enables a huge eruption of creativity. And this festival in the desert, which involves, when you think about going there and settling, which involves, you don't have a lot of resources, you have to bring all your own water, going to the bathroom has to be carefully orchestrated. It's a very fragile ecosystem. And the ethos of this festival is to leave no trace. And so not only are they creative in terms of creating these artistic installations and these sort of rituals and revelations and reevaluations of what it is to live as a community, they're forced to figure out how to live sustainably in that environment. And what that means is that this sort of fringe festival then becomes an incubator for all kinds of exciting ideas for community and for development in an environment that's getting increasingly fragile and that needs to be lived in sustainably, whether you have access to water or not. So, another slide just to show the level of creativity that's involved and also ritual and magic. It's interesting to note that the desert doesn't only inspire a kind of sustainable approach, but it ignites the imagination, like I said, because it is so bare. So when one thinks about biophilia and the idea of our attachment to nature and our integration with nature, usually the desert is not the first thing that comes to mind. Generally, people, when they think about biophilia, think about plants and they think about greenery. What is it about the desert as a symbol for biophilia that is so potent right now? Is it saying, what if the world itself is not a fertile and inviting environment, but an environment in which resources are getting less and less, and which our environment is actually suffering more and more, and therefore the biophilia, the idea of life, of living life that we're a part of, is very precarious. And in order to survive in that environment, it actually needs special attention. So in this context, biophilia is the oasis in the desert, right? It's all the elements that make life possible. It's greenery, it's agriculture, it's water, it's shelter, it's wind, cool winds. It's all these things that within a hostile environment become things we can't take for granted, but need to engineer and need to understand. And again, we can see how the desert as a symbol for the time that we're living in and the challenges that we're living in is very potent. And then the role of biophilia within that story, within that mythology, as the oasis, as the area where life is allowed to ferment and be abundant, is extremely important. One of the things about the desert is that cultures have survived in the deserts for thousands and thousands of years. And one of the things that is important about understanding the desert is that it's much stronger and more powerful than anyone who lives within it. And people that want to survive in the desert cannot impose their own will on the desert. They need to adapt. And more than that, they need to be able to find the sources of water, to work with the sources of water, to reorient the sources of water, to build around huge, massive rock structures that you are not able to blast. And so there's kind of a spirit of submission in surviving in the desert that, again, I think is a very important point. One of the things about the desert is that without community, also, without being able to survive in the desert, without having a community of people around you, and especially people that are knowledgeable and an infrastructure that builds up an oasis, you can't survive. And so, again, that idea of collaboration and commitment and community is extremely important in the desert. And again, we can see why that would be an important mythology right now. One of the things, I'm not going to stop too long on this slide, but one of the things I want to point out on is biophilia is it's a new design approach. And if I think about the spirit of biophilia, and I'm going to go back on this slide and talk about it, the spirit of biophilia is that fundamentally human beings evolved within nature and evolved to be well and to adapt and to understand and to communicate and to be in harmony with nature. The idea that we then, in the last, let's say, 200 or 300 years of industrialization, have moved away from nature into these sort of abstract linear gray spaces that we call, cities. The idea is that we have deprived ourselves of something that makes us fundamentally human, and by doing so, have put our health in danger. We've put our mental health in danger, we've put our physical health in danger. And the theory of biophilia, which was developed by E.O. Wilson, who was not a designer, not an artist, but a sociologist and a biologist, is that we are a part of nature, and that our well-being and our development as a species is in response to nature. And so if we take that away, you can think of yourself as leaning against something, and if that thing is taken away, you fall, right? If that support system is taken away, you fall. And so biophilia is the theory that a human being can't be well unless they are immersed in a multi-sensory, soothing, natural environment. And that is the essence of biophilia. And the desert as a symbol, when you think about it, the desert as a symbol has no water, it has incredible heat, it has no shelter. It is the epitome of the metaphor of a concrete jungle or the city. And if you take yourself out of that situation, and if you are separated from nature, from water, from greenery, and from other people and community, then you're not going to be able to live. And that's one of the most fundamental theories about biophilia and about some of the existential crisis that we're having in our cities right now, with suicidal rates, with all kinds of health challenges and things like this. So the idea that these are, what they did was they said, it is probably utopian to imagine that we can go back to a Garden of Eden, let's analyze what it is about nature that is so important to us. Let's analyze what stimulates us, what we're responding to, and let's break it down into principles that designers and architects and city planners can refer to so that we can mimic or recreate those parts of nature. And this is a list by Terrapin Bright Green, which is a consulting agency in the States, and their leaders. And I absolutely suggest that you check them out. They've been able to distill, this is a new discipline and there's a lot of dissenting voices. They've been able to distill this down to 14 patterns, which you'll get when you get the pamphlet after this talk, and you'll be able to look at it. But just to keep in mind that there is a strategic approach to recreating a natural environment. One of the things about the desert that I think, again, is important to talk about when we're saying, why is the desert important? Why is it a mirror of what's happening within us as a culture? And it's basically, the desert, when you think about it, is a threshold for a turning point. It's a point of decision. You are in the desert and you have a time to reflect, or sort of, it's because the desert is so arid and because it's so otherworldly and because it doesn't have a kind of net of biophilic life around us. We get to reevaluate who we are and where we're going as a culture, which is extremely important right now. And one of the things about the symbolism of the desert is that it is both a symbol of promise and a symbol of potential peril, right? It has been associated with a kind of spiritual insight, a kind of monasticism of our fathers going into the desert and meditating in caves and having great insight and understanding what's important and being able to then return to people and share what it is that's valuable and what it is that's going to get us through. But it's also, you know, it can be very isolating. It can be perilous. There's a chance that you'll go in there and you won't survive. And so as a symbol, it's a very powerful, incubator, and in a lot of ways represents, to a large degree, the time we're going through right now. Are we facing a potential utopian future where science will save us and we'll have an egalitarian culture, we'll have an inclusive culture, we'll have, you know, an environmentally conscious culture? Or are we going into a dystopian future with a lot of authoritarian regimes? And as we face that, as we exist in that limbo, the desert exists as a symbol for that. So we're seeing that in a lot of our design elements. We're seeing caves, we're seeing places where people can go and retreat and meditate. We're seeing a lot of light coming from above, or from, you know, as if we were in a cave below. And so we're seeing a lot of that light coming from above, which, like we saw in the past slide, is a symbol of contemplation. It is a symbol of focusing on the sky, means to a large degree that we're focusing on greater principles, greater, the kind of deep written laws of the culture, the things that transcend our everyday life. If we're looking outward through windows and we're looking at the terrain, then we're able to, or we tend to imagine our own destiny. We tend to be looking for enemies or whatever. We're deeply engaged in the minutiae of our own life. If we're looking upward and our exit point is the sky, which is theoretically still biophilic because it's still nature, we're thinking about the bigger issues. So we can see that being reflected in a lot of our design, a lot of these skylights. Again, one of the things about the desert is that it's not necessarily an easy place to be. And one of the things that is happening with our with the cultural turn towards the desert is a thinking about what is it what is it that allowed ancient cultures to thrive? How did ancient cultures with very little technology and, you know, very little access to resources, how did they survive in the desert? And one of the things that they talk about, one of the things that comes up again and again is this idea of desert laws or of desert power. And it's this sense that there are 3 laws that I think are incredibly applicable to our time now, and that also relate to our orientation towards biophilia and sustainability and being able to create a kind of oasis, let's say, in the desert of our environment and of our cities, is, first of all, to be fundamentally satisfied with less. And we see that as a huge trend in the design industry, this kind of minimalism, which, I mean, if you think about the desert, there's nothing more minimalistic than the desert. But it's this idea that you are satisfied with getting just enough and not with a kind of luxury or excess. So that would be the first law of the desert. The second law of the desert would be, how can we be as innovative and as resourceful as possible and take advantage of those opportunities that we actually do have access to? And in a time of crisis, there's nothing more advantageous than having that skill. And then the third thing is, this is a tough environment and there are not a lot of resources. We need to think about the generations that are going to come. So can we afford to live the way we've always been living, in this kind of excess, and have this kind of optimism that the generations that precede us are going to be able to solve the problems we create? Or are we going to start thinking about the generations that come after us, generations ahead of us, and make sure that we're living in a sustainable way that they can mimic? So one of the first list I showed you was kind of biophilic attributes or ways in which we interact with nature that aren't necessarily about recreating nature or bringing plants in, but are about recreating that conversation or that relationship with nature. And this is another list, and this is an important list. This is a list about what it is to live in a desert or in an environment with very limited resources. And these are garnered through studies of ancient cultures and how they lived with with minimal technology in very harsh environments for thousands of years. And so again, this is a list that will come in the presentation that we're going to send, so I'm not going to go too much into it. But I'm going to talk here about some of the lessons that we've learned from ancient deserts. And one of the things I think that's fascinating is that, yes, there are very practical lessons to learn from ancient cultures. But what's really fascinating is the frequency with which ancient cultures are appearing in our aesthetics again, in our science fiction, and in our storytelling. And I'm thinking right now of Dune in particular, that just came out. I went to see Dune with a group of friends, and a friend of mine commented that what's fascinating about this is, even though it's in the far future and theoretically there's a huge amount of technology that's developed, what we're looking at is something very analog, is something that almost looks like an ancient desert culture. The question is, why, when we're telling that story as artists and as designers, why, when we're looking in the future, are we projecting the past cultures into the future as opposed to slick supersonic cultures? And what it comes down to, I believe, is that these ancient cultures have actually been more successful than we are. They've been more successful at living within their environment, within their means, and sustaining cultures for thousands of years. And so there's no surprise that we're looking back to that culture and back to those environments as sources for both design and sustainable practices. And one of the, and this is something again that we break down more when we go sort of into the written document. But what's one of the things here that I think is fascinating is on the top left here are these sort of towers with slits in them that almost look like the striations of the wind on sand. So it almost looks like an aesthetic decision to mimic the parts of the design of the desert. But these are actually called wind towers, and they're wind catchers. And what they do is they catch any of the wind that is circulating around the desert. They catch them in these towers. They force them down into the homes that the people live in, and they passively cool these homes. And it's a kind of air conditioning, if you will. And the desert is a windy place. And so instead of protecting themselves against the wind and then sort of, you know, becoming overheated in these stale environments, they're like, how do we adapt to the reality of the wind, protect ourselves from the heat, but still get the relief from the wind? A great example. And another kind of wisdom that comes from the desert is this idea of a courtyard, which is that something as precious as biological life, as water, and as trees, in an environment that's arid or harsh, cannot be exposed. It must be protected within a courtyard, within a deep water reserve with very little superficial, with very little surface, because then there's more evaporation, things like that. And so the idea of the courtyard, or the sort of the hidden garden that is protected in a lot of ways the way we need to be protected, again, going back to this idea of biophilia, of the world, of the natural world as an extension or a part of who we are, needing the same amount of protection or safety as we do in a harsh environment. One of the, another great desert habitat is Mesa Verde in Colorado. And again, when they look at why would they have built within this cliff face, because it was actually extremely difficult to get to. They had ladders or rope ladders. It's not clear, but it was actually very hard to get to. And apart from the sort of the strategic reasons for being there, what they realized is that it was kind of perfectly well placed for this kind of passive solar heating, that in the summer, the rays would hit the rocks, they would get sort of stored in the local materials, they would heat up the place organically, and then in the winter, the way the rays hit was also protective, and to a large degree protected them from the wind and the cold. So something that on the face of it looks very primitive is actually like it's working with the elements, and there's a kind of degree of sophistication because there's a kind of passive flowing with the elements that we need to learn from. So again, I love, this is actually a slide from one of the art directors imagining, in the top corner, it's one of the art directors imagining the culture of the Freeman in the movie Dune. And in the movie Dune, really the setup, very simply for those of you who aren't aware of it, there's a desert planet and there's a native desert culture, and then there's an invading or a kind of authoritarian foreign community that rules the planet, and they do that because they have access to resources on the planet. And the question here is not that. The question here is the Freeman and how they live and how they survive. And what is so fascinating about this story is that the people that survive in the desert have obviously extremely eco-friendly strategies about surviving, but they're also the moral center of the story, reinforcing what we were saying about the desert as a source of wisdom and as a source of purity and a kind of lack of decadence. And again, understanding how that as a desirable quality is going to influence our design. I mean, the thing about working with natural light as a designer is that to a large degree, unless you're creating something from scratch and you're an architect and you can build according to the sunset and the sunrise, you don't have a lot of control. And so, I mean, that's why lighting and all of these kinds of interventions are super important. But one of the things about this kind of aesthetic is indirect light, is light that changes over time, is that light that is extremely strong, dramatic, enters at an angle, and then shifts over time. So it's important. And one of the other elements that I think is affecting design so extremely right now is brick and the rise of brick. One of the things that's most, let's say, typical of desert design and of any kind of environment where resources are very limited is that you must use local properties. You cannot afford to bring in the most beautiful marble from Italy or something like this. You need to make use of what's around you, and that has resulted in these structures that are really built out of these kinds of out of adobe and out of sand and out of mud and straw and all these configurations that go to brick. And that aesthetic or that trend then is extending into all kinds of design features. I think one of the things that's the most interesting about desert design is that some of the most interesting architectural projects are happening in these desert cultures. And because, and I think most people that are creative would agree with me on this, when you are faced with limitation, ironically, it forces you to rise to the challenge, and you often have much more innovative, interesting ideas. And there's something about designing in the desert and recognizing the limitations of the desert that push creative people to come with much more innovative solutions. And one of them is that the desert itself must be yielded to, must be designed around. And again, what we're talking about is understanding that nature itself and its limitations are stronger than you, and so you need to make sure that you're close to sources of water, and you need to build around the rock faces, and it makes this kind of monumental, interesting architecture. And right now in the bottom left corner, this is a design by Oppenheim, an architecture firm out of Miami that's working in the United Arab Emirates. And there's a huge project that we're going to look at now for developing the desert and for attracting tourists. And if we see the designs that are emerging or being kind of submitted, they're designs that not only are sustainable and that adapt to the nature around them, but that are fundamentally oriented in that kind of biophilic focus of bringing nature with us, of understanding that creating a habitat for us means creating a habitat for nature, because as the biophilic theory presents, there is no separation between us and nature. So if we're going to live in the desert, then we bring the oasis with us, and the oasis is an extension of us. Again, really looking at a lot of how that impacts our culture. It's fascinating to think about. There's many, many deserts in the world, and there's many, many desert aesthetics. And one of the principles of biophilia that is so important is not only that we respond to and bring in the natural vegetation that survives within that environment and that is indigenous to that environment, because then it's ironically, I mean, of course, much more sustainable. It's that those cultural elements, those cultural expressions about what it is to be human, and those shapes and those forms that we recognize and that we identify with are also part of biophilia. And so when we're recreating the idea of a desert habitat, are we borrowing from the Egyptians? Within the biophilic theory, we are not. We are borrowing from the local culture that has evolved over thousands of years. In this case, let's say it's South American and kind of Mayan and Aztec. And we are integrating those cultural elements into our design as of Oasis, of the Oasis environment. So if we look at the American Southwest, one of the things that is one of, I think, the interesting facts about the American Southwest is that it is one of the places people are immigrating to the most in North America. People are flocking to the American Southwest. It's a cultural haven. There's a tremendous amount of artistic growth and economic growth and imagination, and it's a really desirable place to live. But one of the things that's happening because of that is that as the population grows, it puts stress on the existing infrastructure that's already in place. And one of the things about the Southwest is that when cities were established, they did not base their design on sort of these biophilic and sustainable practices of ancient cultures. They imposed the grid-like modern idea of what a city was and how it could run efficiently. And those cities necessarily use a tremendous amount of resources and are not actually perfectly oriented towards desert conditions. The amassing of heat, the releasing of heat, how does the sunlight, like whether your orientation is towards the west or not, if the sunlight can come into the room or not, and all of these considerations that were native to people that lived within small communities and didn't have the resources or the money or the technology to impose themselves on the desert, but had to adapt themselves. None of those things happened as we came and conquered this continent. But as people moved to the Southwest and put this incredible pressure on the system's weaknesses are beginning to show. And one of the things that's happening is they're saying, okay, we need to return to or understand the principles of the desert and how other people lived here to be able to sustain this incredible influx of people. And in fact, a lot of the cities, at least I think Phoenix recently became a biophilic city. And what that means is they're focusing on sustaining and taking care of the natural reserves around the city. The most interesting thing is the question of the city itself, right? If the city itself is still a tremendous draw or drain on power and on water, then it becomes impossible to sustain the life around the city in these national parks. So biophilia, as much as people think it's about bringing the outdoors in, it's really about how does the urban environment make itself part of its surrounding, make itself not too much of a burden on the natural environment in which it's found. And one of the things Tucson, Arizona, is doing is they have this technology where they can look at a city and they can determine where the heat is accumulating within the city. So one of the things about a modern city is that unlike these ancient desert cities that have kind of grown up organically and sort of responded to the wind and the sun and sort of oriented themselves optimally to protect themselves against the sun, to catch the wind, these cities were sort of imposed on the landscape and are actually heat generating machines right now. They're like heat canyons. And one of the things they've done is they've been able to use this technology to do this, to map the heat in the city, and then to strategically plant these gardens or these sort of microclimates within the city to bring the temperature of the city down. And this goes back to what we were talking about with the idea of a courtyard, the idea of these sort of protected, enclosed, small interventions of vegetation that balance out sort of, or that bring a kind of oasis condition into the city. And obviously roof gardens and all of these things are a huge part of that design. And when we look even now, this is at the Utah Museum of Natural History in Utah, one of the things that we're doing is not only are we taking into consideration these kind of sustainable practices, but we're recognizing that a lot of this ancient design, because it used local materials, blended into the landscape and became part of the landscape. So what does it mean as designers and architects to use local materials and to try to mimic the environment that we're in so that the architecture itself becomes integrated into the landscape? And one of the reasons for this, if we think about it, is that there's less and less nature, right? There's less and less natural environments. And if the biophilic theory is correct, and if we as people, as humans, need to be or are extended into the environment, if that's part of who we are, then even our built environment needs to mimic, needs to mirror, or needs to reference the natural environment for us to be as well, as productive, as functional as possible. And so there's this orientation towards mimicking the shapes of the landscape around us, using the materials from the landscape around us, and not necessarily camouflaging, but sort of building on the beauty of the surrounding environment. And this, obviously, this museum does it very beautifully. And it's interesting to think about how this then affects fashion and design, because people in the aesthetic environment were all being fed by the same mythology, and the idea of the desert pilgrim or the survivor. And I think as we look at fashion, you're going to see this more and more, this idea of the nomad or the desert nomad being the urban nomad, right? So the desert landscape and the urban landscape sort of being interchangeable, and the idea of being, as Erin was saying at the beginning of this conversation, of being a traveler, of being a Bedouin, of being somebody that can move within the city but carries their water with them, that carries their basic essential needs with them, affects then the aesthetics. So there's sort of this new age pioneer moving through this desert environment, and in a lot of ways wearing the colors of that environment, of that indigenous environment. So after we leave that that idea of kind of sustainability in the day-to-day life, we think, well, what about luxury? Especially for us that work in the design industry, many of our projects and many of our areas of interest are in the hospitality milieu or in the service milieu, and the idea of luxury doesn't necessarily jibe with sustainability, and that's an issue. One of the other things that is, I think, interesting when we're looking at, let's say, a city like Las Vegas that definitely is struggling with issues of desertification and water, is to look back at the city of Petra, which beginning 400 BC and about the turn of the century was one of the most famous cities in Jordan on the trade route, and was incredibly innovative. And despite the fact that it was dead in the middle of an incredibly arid desert, was one of the most luxurious and coveted stopovers on the trade route. And that has to do with the fact that the Nabateans, or the people that built Petra, really understood how, again, all the things that we talked about, desert power, they really understood how to position themselves relative to a source of water that was ongoing, how to channel that water into their town, how to orient the town for the sun and the wind. So they have passive solar and passive wind power. And they obviously, they actually had huge amounts of gardens and dates, but they built native vegetables. And in that time and in that period, a lot of people actually consider Petra the Vegas of the desert. It was a pleasure dome, and it had huge pools of water, and it had all kinds of shows of extravagance. So the question, the idea that if we engage in these practices, we will all live in these incredibly desperate circumstances doesn't have to be true. The idea here is that if we can leverage this understanding, first of all, of what's essential to us, and which is that we need to live in a biophilic environment because we are more than ourselves, we are connected to our environment, and the idea that we need to live sustainably. If we can really marshal and understand that theory, there's absolutely no reason that we can't create these magical pleasure experiences for ourselves. And one of the other things about the desert that we haven't touched on yet is the kind of spectacular night sky, which again goes to that idea of awe and beauty and transcendence. And so the desert then can become a place, if we can accommodate those limitations, a place where we learn to live in luxury again and in mystery. And so that's where we come to the idea of the promise of the desert, which is as deeply a part of the mythology as the limitations of the desert, as the stress and the harshness of the desert, which is that it is this blank canvas and this open space where we can recreate ourselves and learn to live in community and learn to live creatively and learn to live magically. It makes us again think back to Burning Man, this incredible festival in the desert that's attracting, I mean, I think at this point there's 80,000 people that go and sort of established as sort of semi-permanent residents. This idea that it is possible within limitation and in harmony with the world to create these spectacular, special, awe-inspiring environments. That takes us actually to the United Emirates, and there's an incredibly interesting project happening right now where they're trying to revitalize the desert in order to draw attention to the culture and to the history, and also to obviously attract tourism. And because of that, they've engaged some of the most phenomenal architects in the world to propose projects. And what's so interesting about the projects that they're proposing is that they're all taking advantage of that desert wisdom. And they're trying to figure out not only how to build in the desert with the most minimal impact, but also how can that design be as sustainable as possible, meaning that it doesn't ask for a lot of energy, it doesn't ask for a lot of insulation, it doesn't ask for a lot of air conditioning and things like that for it to be able to survive. And so they're looking back to a lot of these ancient traditions in the past. And if you read up on these projects, the architects will openly admit that they're looking at ancient cultures and trying to understand how they did it. And they're building within structures themselves, and they're using the vernacular or the kind of knowledge of design that's been built up over the centuries, this idea, let's say, of screens that let in light, but also are inherently protective. One of the most interesting parts, again, of the design is that it is, like we saw with Mesa Verde, like we saw with Petra, it's built within the stone itself. It's dug within the stone because it's obviously a natural insulator. It's also extremely dramatic, but it also allows for kind of the kind of pristine aesthetic of the environment to be maintained. But what's incredible, even in this design, where we can see that hidden within the rock face is this sort of suggestion of an inner palace. There's still something extremely palatial and luxurious in the exposed columns within this rock face. And in the lower right corner, again, is a reference to the Dune movie, because one of the challenges of the Dune movie for the set designer was to recreate a sense of luxury or spaciousness within an incredibly harsh environment. And if you look at the design in those movies, he uses a lot of the desert vernacular, especially from the Arab cultures, as part of how he creates these palatial suites. One of the let's say propositions of this project in particular, which is called the Sharan Resort, excuse me if I'm not pronouncing it correctly, is that it is camouflaged. It is within the rock face, and you are really only aware of the design at night when the lights come on. And another fascinating thing, another kind of reference to the sort of Mesa Verde design strategy, very ethereal. One of the things that's so interesting about recreating those spaces in the interior, the designer Jean Nouvel, was that he wanted to preserve the effects that the light would have coming through the natural geological formations of the desert. So he recreated in these verandas the sort of pot-marked organic hole, so that the light coming through would create the same sort of shadow speckled space that it would have in an ancient cave. And again, it's interesting when we talk about biophilia, and I think a lot of people again associate it with plants, but when we think about some of the more ephemeral qualities of biophilia, is some like dynamic light that changes over time, light that moves, like as the clouds go through the skies, the shadows change in the home. And so even in a kind of desert cave where we would imagine that our connection to organic life is very limited, we would still be having this exposure to biophilic elements. And it was incredibly important for him to incorporate that into his design. But again, when we go back to one of the things about biophilia is that you're not only incorporating the sort of traditions of the culture of the environment, of the landscape, you're also bringing in the vernacular of the culture. And so he still has these kind of very highly geometric screens that remind us of sort of Arabic culture, because he's blending those two stories. And I again will go back, because I think it's so important in understanding biophilia, that what biophilia is really about is about optimizing our environment so that we can function as well as possible. And as human beings, we are both a blend of nature and culture. And so biophilia is always going to take aspects of the natural environment it's in and then incorporate the indigenous culture, the indigenous design language into that in order to create these optimal environments. And I love this. It's just a very modern take. We see that it has all the qualities of a cave. It has the top and the back are protected. There's light in the front. It has the screen. It has these kind of raw basic elements, but it's interesting to see a kind of modern interpretation of what it is to take the vernacular or the kind of knowledge of that culture and project it into a modern space. Some more ideas is that's the Petra, that's the inner cave. And again, we're seeing the palette that is so dominant in our culture and in the design culture right now. And why? And it's like, well, here it is. Here are the naturally occurring reds and oranges and beiges that occur in the desert, and that are now being brought into design all over the world. One of the things that, again, we hinted at, and I want to come back to, is this idea that as we move forward into the future, into environments that are maybe more resource scarce and more vulnerable, we need to look into the past and to the traditions of the past and to the basic technology of the past to be able to survive. So one of the things that's happening on the aesthetic level that is really exciting is a kind of blend of high tech and low tech, is this kind of blend of very rudimentary raw materials that have a kind of biophilic appeal or essence, and technology. And so what we're looking at right here is a kind of visualization of the Oppenheimer project in the desert, the idea that they're looking out of a gallery space in the rock wall at the desert, but the space itself is a kind of blend between high tech and low tech. Again, one of the things that is so fascinating about what's happening with the desert and with Mars in particular is that there's a huge movement in the hospitality industry, especially in desert regions. And, you know, desert regions, ironically, don't only refer to sand. They refer to any environment that is hostile to human beings. There can be the Arctic desert, there's the lunar desert, there's Mars. So all these environments in which you need to create a habitat or an oasis that extends beyond you, right? And again, going back to what is the lesson for the desert in terms of biophilia, is that you are not separate from nature. So if you yourself alone without any kind of natural habitat go out into a harsh environment, right? Either the environment of the desert or the environment of Mars with no atmosphere that can sustain you, you won't survive. So the idea of the oasis, of creating or bringing with you part of your habitat into all of these environments, becomes essential. And one of the things that's if we talk about shared or collective imagination and sort of preparing ourselves for the future, one of the new things right now is to travel to these very remote locations and have these experiences within these sort of safe enclaves, with these sort of small oases that we can retreat to and then look at the wild nature around us. So what we're looking at right here is a sort of glamping in the desert in Jordan, where you get to live in these tents and look at the night sky and look at the desert, but obviously from the safety of your own personal little oasis. And I think that that's in a lot of ways a preparation for the world that we're going to be living in, and kind of a way of a rehearsal, if you want, a dress rehearsal, which is a lot of what arts are. So what's happening with Burning Man is that because it is so popular, they have decided that there's actually somebody with land right next to the Burning Man, the place where Burning Man happens, that is going to build a permanent structure. And what they've done is they've asked local, like, young designers, ingenious designers, to propose permanent structures that could live in the desert, but that would be sustainable and that would obviously create or support a certain kind of oasis. And one of the projects I find really fascinating, one of the top projects of the past year, is something where you can see that in the center of this community, they've actually built a wind tower. And they've built all of these, I'm not sure if you can see when you go deep inside, they've built these kind of deep impressions where there's sort of oases or courtyards of protected vegetation. If you can see where all the vegetation is within the desert, it is dug down within the sand, right? It's below the wind, and it's basically a structure that takes into account a lot of the strategic architectural strategies of these ancient cities. And this idea that you're digging within the ground and that you're creating these sort of courtyards or safe spaces or microclimates that people could exist within in the desert itself. So what does this trend mean if you don't live in a desert? And one of the things that I think is becoming clear in all of the literature on what's happening with climate change is that urban cities, unfortunately, in their sort of concrete, their kind of dominance of concrete and of cement, are in effect urban deserts. And they're not environments in which animals or humans or vegetation thrive. They're congested. they're dense, they're hot, they're depressing. And the question here is, if you were to treat the city or the jungle, the kind of concrete jungle, with the same knowledge, aesthetics, or strategy of the desert, how would you approach that city? And the idea is that you would create oases within the city itself. And you would be able to, within each building, on street corners, create these green spaces that exist, that are protected within a structure, that people can go to sort of as a retreat, as an escape from the city. One of the best examples of that is in the New York Times building in New York City. It has an inner courtyard that has won awards, that is considered one of the best kind of experiments in a sense, desert design. Because what it is in the middle of this concrete jungle, there is the center of the building has a birch tree forest. And when they were building this kind of sanctuary, this kind of inner garden sanctuary for the building, they did all the research that ancient people did. They looked at airflow, they looked at light, they looked at how much light it would get over the course of the day. They analyzed all of these factors, and they built the garden in the most optimal place. And that garden, which they can open all of the doors around, creates this sort of microclimate that's much cooler in the summer, much warmer in the winter for all the people that work there. And it's considered now the heart of the building. So obviously the other thing about it is the thing that I think is so interesting about the design of this courtyard in particular in the middle of a building is this recognition that nature as an idea, and this is a much more controversial idea, but it's an idea that's being put forth by a lot of thinkers right now, is that as nature disappears and as we as a species take over more and more of the land on this planet, the kind of luxury of thinking of nature as something out there that we can drive to, right? That's our cabin in the woods, is less and less true. And the idea that the kind of romantic notion of us as the city of one thing and the country as another is no longer sustainable. The idea now is that nature, that we are part of nature, and wherever we are is nature, and therefore we need to integrate that into our design philosophies, is another lesson of the desert. And so what does it mean to have rooftop gardens and to have integrated courtyards, and then even within the office itself, for people that don't have the luxury to have an outdoor garden, is this new standard, this new philosophy of creating within the office itself an oasis, a green space. Definitely we have the technology to grow plants inside and to do all these things and to bring natural environments and natural materials in. And again, I chose this office because this is the Indeed office in Tokyo. They call this an oasis. They literally have designed it as an oasis, but they've designed it with all their own cultural references. They've even painted the sun in a kind of stylistic way that still represents nature. And for them, this is their expression of nature. Whereas we can see another smart office in Dubai that also is built around an oasis, but it has its own vernacular language. Here it's going to be discussing the sand dunes and the sort of how and where there is vegetation, it's a little more sparse, it's a little more special, and the colors of the desert dominate the design. The idea here is that the oasis or the retreat or the natural environment exists within the building and in the vernacular of the culture. So the funny thing, one of the really powerful things about this theory is that as we move towards space travel and as we go to the ultimate desert, if you think about it, which is outer space. I mean, there is nothing in that environment that is not hostile to our survival. One of the things they've noticed about astronauts that spend all this time in space is that the separation from the natural world is extremely detrimental. And the question becomes, how, if we want to do space travel, and if we understand that our health, our mental and physical health is connected to the natural environment, how are we going to travel in space? And one of the things that's evolving in this field is something called synthetic natural world. And we all have seen this, the kind of, what would it mean to be able to create digital representations of the world, of the natural world. And also, for those of you who've ever been to an art installation at a museum, it's not limited to the visuals. You can create auditory, you can create sense sensation, right? But it's these sort of digital or artificial environments that recreate nature. And the question is that good enough? Can that sustain us over months of space travel, let's say, as we decide that we want to go and colonize Earth? And you know what? They don't know yet. They don't know. It's definitely something that NASA and people like that are doing research into, but they cannot affirm for sure. But it definitely can't hurt. And you know, I'm optimistic that that will work. One of the areas in which the imagination really has to stretch itself is when we imagine colonizing Mars. And one of the fascinating things about this dream is how it's influencing or affecting the creative community, who are trying to imagine what it would mean to live in Mars or on Mars. And it is the ultimate sustainability challenge, because you cannot rely on bringing things from Earth, right? So you need to be able to work with the local materials. So it's obviously a sustainable challenge. But then we also recognize that it doesn't have an atmosphere or the natural environment that we've evolved to live in. So it's the ultimate biophilic challenge. And one of the projects that I think is the most interesting is the one that I think takes into account all of these sort of the wisdom of desert design that we've been talking about with some of the other projects. And if you can see in the upper right corner, one of the things they decided is that if one of the few places that it would be safe to live on Mars would be underground, theoretically protected from the radiation, and obviously there's have an artificial atmosphere. But what they've said is that humans need to be able to see. They need to be able to look out at the landscape. They need to be able to have something called prospect, which is one of the most important aspects of biophilic theory, to be able to look out at the horizon. So what are you going to do if you need to be protected within the kind of within the Earth itself, but still have vision? Is that you're going to build into the side of a cliff face, just like Mesa Verde did, and just like they're doing right now in the United Emirates with their luxury hotels that they're building into rock faces. Again, it's the idea of building in to these environments. And that cliff face is one of the suggested cities. It's called Nua. And at the bottom left corner, what you're seeing is this, what they have is a module or something that's a kind of room that's implanted within the building. So all of these would be modules within the building that would be connected through an infrastructure. What's fascinating about these modules and what is so important to them is creating these gardens or green spaces in all these modules. So that you're taking that oasis notion that can't exist on the planet itself and you're building it into the infrastructure of the planet itself. One of the other aspects that I think of desert power and is this fact that as a community, we can't survive on our own, and we need to depend on the kind of ingenuity and the collaboration of the community at large. How does that affect design? How does that affect us as artists? Again, it's this idea that the public space is more important than the private space. The public space becomes the area where there's greenery, where there's complexity, where there's pleasure, And the sleeping, the place where you sleep, becomes the sort of private sanctuary, but there's much less design or resources that are given to the private spaces. So here we are again, talking again about the urban desert. And it's interesting to note that there's more and more art about people wearing kind of lunar or space outfits in cities. And it's this idea that the city itself is becoming, or the planet itself is becoming less hospitable to humans. It's the artists again, sort of in metaphor, warning us about this shift, and us seeing it more and more in the artwork. And here again, it's the idea that how are we going to be able to create around us, right? Because a spacesuit is the ultimate oasis. It has oxygen, it has water. How are you going to create that around us as we go forward? And again, the answer is we're going to look to the past and understand the deep wisdom that the past has to teach us, and then recreate real or real synthetic hybrids that we're going to be able to live with in the future. Here's another, I'm going to end with this new city. I think it's called Tolosa or Toloda. I apologize if I've forgotten the name. But it is a proposed city in the American Southwest, which is, again, what we were saying, one of the most coveted areas to live in, but it has its limitations. It's a fragile environment. And this is a city that one of the ex-execs at Walmart is trying to build. It's a proposed city in the Southwest Desert. And what I find fascinating, again, is that right in the center of the city, we have these sort of wind tunnels. It's a city that is extremely dense, that is built around the sun and the wind, that has a huge amount of water preservation and reuse, and is sort of fantasy of how we'll be able to go forward in the future. Thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed that, and come back. So I'm not sure if, there you are.
I'm back.
Okay,
wow.
You're back.
Really, really tremendous. I'm almost at a loss for words. There's so much to take in there.
I know, it's very big. It's a trend that's going to be around for a while, I think.
It just seems the desert aesthetic really invokes a truly ironic palette at every turn. You reminded me also there's a law in Jerusalem that was actually that came into being around World War I during British Mandate period, that required that all buildings going forward, it's ironic because it's not indigenous to the area, it's coming from an outside colonizing country, where they invoked a law where all buildings need to be built out of what's called Jerusalem stone, which means that it's quarried within a very close proximity to the city, and all buildings, whether modern or ancient, are built out of this stone. And if you walk around Jerusalem, you can literally walk by buildings that are 3,000, 4,000 years old, and built out of the exact same brick material, out of brand new, extremely modern buildings. So it's this interesting juxtaposition of irony of design.
Aaron, what that makes me think of is that one of the things that I found out in my research is one of the reasons people say use local materials is because part of desert power, right, is predicting or forecasting thousands of years in the future, right? What does it mean to create a sustainable environment, and how are other people going to be able to live here when we're gone? And one of the things they imagine is that if you build with local materials, as the building becomes less important or not useful anymore, it then falls apart and kind of becomes again part of the environment, right? Because you don't have all these foreign elements in it that can't be reabsorbed. So it's literally part of caring for the generations that are going to come. Ironically, it's part of that philosophy. So
Beautiful.
it's very strategic. Yeah.
Well, I like the way you sort of brought it forward. Like what I took from it a lot is, this sort of Garden of Eden opportunity
Yes.
within a tabula rasa environment is also
Yes.
very ironic, because obviously we don't
Yes.
associate the Garden of Eden with our own creativity, but rather with God's creativity, something that we
Right.
had to acclimatize to. Whereas all of a sudden that's sort of being flipped on its side.
Well, one of the, I love that you brought this up, because I forgot to say this, is that one of the ironies of all of this kind of ingenious effort to colonize the Earth, one of the ironies is that whether or not we're ever able to colonize Mars, a lot of those insights, inventions, and innovations are being applied to us and how to live sustainably and longer on this planet. So
Right.
even if that image of that new Garden of Eden is what excites and propels people to think creatively and to apply their energy to it, it still benefits humankind, because all those inventions still come back and help us live within our growing cities. So
Right
that's one of the good things about it.
Listen, we don't have a lot of time left. Obviously, we've gone a little bit over. There was many questions. I'm just going to read to you 3 questions that came through all in one shot, but I think you answered all of them, but I just want you to hear the type of questions that were being asked.
Sure.
The first one is, do you feel that this trend is hearkening in a new connection to our spiritual origins through the desert aesthetic?
Yes.
The second one is, how does the desert design aesthetic fuse multiple technologies within our living environments? And the third question that stuck out for me was, how does the aesthetic element of the desert aesthetic infuse itself into design trends? Do we need to design toward oases of restraint?
Yes. And that's the thing that I found almost the most profound about this trend was, what does it take? What are the inner qualities that it takes to be able to survive in an environment that is fragile and where resources are scarce? And that idea of desert power that we talked about, that's also kind of a calling card in the movie Dune, is that being satisfied with less and being hugely innovative and resourceful about what we do with what we do have access to is one of the secrets to being able to survive in a very harsh environment. And absolutely, that becomes part of the aesthetic. But I hope what I was showing with Petra and sort of these more sort of luxurious things is that if it's done effectively, it doesn't mean that you don't have any pleasure or magic or wonder. But you still, even in those resorts in the desert, they still have water. They're still cleaning their water, their gray water. They're still using passive solar and passive wind technology. They're doing everything they can to minimize their impact. And if that's done effectively, really, there's a lot that can be done with that creatively. So it's not that we're all going to live as monks. I think that's important to say.
That's good to know.
Yeah, but the desert knowledge is, I think the most important thing is to recognize that we're not separate from nature, and therefore we have to be able to create an oasis around ourselves to be able to survive in these environments. And in order for that to happen, when we're designing, when we're building, we can't only consider our own needs. We have to consider the needs of the whole oasis. How is the whole oasis going to survive? Because we need to be in that oasis. We can't live without that oasis.
Right on.
And Mars is an extreme example of that, but it's true here on Earth as well.
Right on. All right. Well, look, with that, truly exciting stuff.
Great.
I'm really looking forward to taking this up again in the new year. We'll do some more of these webinars and continue along.
We're returning to. We're going to go look to the mushrooms. Our new inspiration. I'm excited about that. Lots to learn there.
I want to thank everybody for joining. We had a really good attendance yet again, and people really stayed on for this one too. And thank you, everybody. I hope you got a lot out of it. There'll be a link to the video of the webinar sent out with a design packet tomorrow. I do want to wish all of our American friends across the border a wonderful Thanksgiving next week.
Yes.
And I want to wish everybody a tremendous holiday season and looking forward to getting back together in 2022. And most of all, Alem, I'd like to thank you again for a truly inspiring and wonderful, wonderful presentation.
Thanks for giving me a chance to share what I'm passionate about.
Right on,
Really.
as we all are.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay.
All right.
Bye.
Bye for now. Ciao.
Bye.